In this video, I'm going to try and connect the Huang study to the topic that we're going to be talking about this week, just in these videos, which is sport in Melbourne. So I just want to make sure that we're all understanding exactly what the relation between these two elements are, because I think the reading this week is very, very good, very, very important, very, very usable, and I just want to make sure that we understand how we can transport the ideas that we find in Huang's work to to a Melbourne setting. So let's begin with the Huang study and Huang's notion of media-induced tourism as a particular kind of media influence. So let's think about what that means. So what the Huang study is about, I think it represents a class of research where people have done this kind of research in relation to a number of different kinds of very popular media products. So what Huang is studying is the way that a particular drama, which is set in it's a fictional story which is set in a real place in China. How does that create the desire amongst its audiences and its fans to actually travel to the places where the drama is set? How does that create a set of opportunities for local economies? How do those local economies manage those groups of people, those fans, those audiences? And there are a number of really, really interesting observations in Huang's studies about the way that what Huang is studying is this idea of media tourism, people who come to places not because they want to go to the places themselves, but because they want to be at the place where media narratives are based. Now, there's a range of other places where this has happened. So I mentioned in the previous video about Lord of the Rings and Hobbit tourism to New Zealand, but there's other research too. Many years ago, there was an HBO gangster drama called The Sopranos, which was set in New Jersey in the United States. And there are tours of the Sopranos settings that you can go on. There's an entire book about media tourism related to the show Sex and the City. There are entire Sex and the City tours that you can take. And the really interesting thing about those tours is that they literally create a different geography for tourists to New York City. So we know that Sex and the City is set in New York. And when people go on a Sex and the City tour, if we think about New York, there are certain kinds of landmarks that you might think would be the conventional places where people would go. The Statue of Liberty, Ground Zero, Central Park, so on and so forth. But research on Sex and the City tourism shows that people go to entirely different landmarks. They go to, I guess, I've read the book more than I've watched the show, I confess. But I guess there's a particularly famous cupcake shop in Sex and the City, and this is a big site on the Sex and the City tour. So what we see in research on Sex and the City is the way that that the experience of media tourism in a very important way changes the landscape of a place like New York City. That is, people go to different places because they see different places as being important. And this creates all kinds of opportunities for people in local economies. But in a very profound way, what you see is that when people come, for example, to New York City to be on a Sex and the City tour rather than be in a New York City tour, what you have is a situation where those people have different expectations that create different kinds of economic opportunities that need to be managed in different ways. So the overall point we're making is that when a city like Beijing or New York or Melbourne becomes the site of media production, becomes part of the media gaze, this creates flows of people and different ways of interacting and being within particular places. And this is something you can research. So, for example, in Melbourne at the moment, I know that there was a very famous TV series called Underbelly, which was about gang crime in Melbourne, and there is an Underbelly tour that you can go on. So there are similar kinds of media tourism opportunities. There is a very famous soap opera called Neighbours. You can go on a Neighbours tour of Melbourne. So we can do these things in Melbourne. And I want to give an example, which is the UFC. So again, I want to talk about the way that Melbourne as a particular, I suppose, global landmark in the world of media sport, staged an event which created opportunities to observe media tourism. So if the question is how do media organize, I suppose the question we would ask in relation to all forms of media tourism is how do media affect the economy through providing tourism opportunities, so media effects come through the worlds of leisure. And one of the ways to examine this is to examine why did the UFC come to Melbourne? So 2015, Ronda Rousey, who was the most famous woman athlete in the world at the time, chose to fight in Melbourne. And there's a reason for that. And that's a researchable reason that gives us another way of understanding how we can do research on media tourism through participant observation. And the interesting thing about this is that it wasn't that Melbourne was picked out of the hat, at random, to stage this event. The event came to Melbourne for a particular reason. Firstly, it was symbolically very important. It was hailed by both the organisation and the athletes themselves as a milestone in gender representations. And Melbourne was picked as a particularly suitable place to have this milestone. So the whole event was not just a sporting event, it was a really interesting example of media marketing. It was a particular organization trying to sell its brand through a particular athlete who was also trying to sell their brand. And the question is, how did they choose Melbourne for to stage that performance? And what does that say about Melbourne as a particular kind of media economy? And how can we research this through simply watching how the event unfolded by simply observing what happened? And the other thing is that I'm going to be sort of demonstrating a particular research process through this. So what I'm doing also is kind of breaking down the processes that you would think about when you are doing a research project. So we've kind of got a question that we're trying to explore. How do media actively create a sense of space? And what we want to do is we want to examine that through an example. Now, Huang has the example of Chinese drama. I'm using a different example. My example is Ronda Rousey and the UFC. Now, the next thing we need to do, this is something that we're all trying to find at the moment through our annotated bibliographies, and for our next step is we're trying to find what I call a model paradigm. What I mean by this is a particular theory that helps us organize our thinking and explain our work. And the one that I'm going to use is something called the media sport cultural complex, which is a particularly useful way, I think, of explaining how we can explain media influence by linking media, culture, mobility, and identity. And then the fourth thing we need to do is think about, well, okay, now we've got our research question and our basic theory. How are we going to operationalize this? And the one that I want to talk about, the method I want to use, is participant observation. I want you to pay really, really close attention to this because I think that participant observation is a really, really handy research method for you. And I suppose kind of one of the significant reason we need to know why we're interested in this. And I think the reason why we're interested in this is because of research and a long running interest in media research on the relationship between the media and cultural economy, the way in which media has a social influence by locating the public, locating us in a particular economic model. And that what we need to understand is how media events operate within what we might call message systems, particularly organized ways of telling stories which have cultural implications. So that's the connection between what we're doing in the reading this week, and what we are going to be covering in the videos, which are basically sort of trying to demonstrate how you can take the ideas from the reading and apply them in Melbourne.